Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be covering Operation Safe Pilot. So, beginning in 2002, Operation Safe Pilot was a joint investigation conducted by the Department of Transportation, Inspector General, and the Social Security Administration to determine how many, if any, FAA airman medical certificate holders who had disabilities that they had not disclosed on their applications were simultaneously collecting Social Security benefits. So in 2002, OIG special agents identified a pilot who had been collecting disability benefits for 14 years and had not disclosed that information to the FAA so he could maintain his medical certificate and keep flying. And this led them to look for more pilots who had committed similar offenses. And that initial investigation was based in Northern California, where they identified 46 certificate holders who were ultimately charged by the DOT IG, and 16 of those airmen had their certificates immediately revoked under the FAA's emergency revocation orders powers. Now, in 2002, investigators discovered that Stanmore Cooper, a private pilot's license holder since 1964, had been collecting disability benefits after he was diagnosed with HIV in 1985. However, he did not disclose that information to the FAA because it would have been a disqualifying condition, and he wanted to keep flying, but ultimately he would lose his pilot's license and his medical certificate as a result. Cooper would then sue the FAA, claiming that they had violated his privacy and caused him to suffer emotional and mental stress. And then FAA versus Cooper worked its way through the U.S. court system, ultimately reaching the U.S. Supreme Court, where in the end, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the actual damages clause in the Privacy Act did not apply and his claims were not covered by the act. So that the U.S. Supreme Court based their reasoning on sovereign immunity. They reasoned that if the U.S. government's sovereign immunity was to be waived, it must have been clearly stated in the statutory text, meaning the Privacy Act. And they also said that the meaning of actual damages in the Privacy Act was not clear to them, and that if Congress had intended for actual damages to cover mental and emotional stress, then it would have explicitly said so in the Privacy Act of 1974. However, they did say that if Cooper had documented proof he had expenses related to his claims, then he would have been eligible to receive compensation under the Act. So, why can they share your information? There are some exceptions so they can share without your consent. The Social Security Administration can disclose your personal information that it maintains in its record system in accordance with routine use if it is compatible with their reasoning for collection. So, meaning if they collected your information because you're claiming disability, then they can share that information. And the VA can disclose it if it's required by another agency or department within the U.S. government. Meaning that if the Social Security Administration needs information from the VA, they can get it, the FAA, so on and so on. Now, the Privacy Act of 1974 mandates that a person's individual records are protected from unfairness, inconvenience, harm, or some way that would cause them embarrassment. However, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to stop them from sharing your information given the court ruling in FAA versus Cooper. So, resulting changes from this case and Operation Safe Pilot were that the FAA updated their Form 8500 8 to include a question that requires an airman to identify if they have received any disability compensation. They also added a notice that would compare the 8500 8 information against other agencies' data that may be providing disability to that individual, meaning that they can compare the info on your 8500 8 to that of the Social Security Administration or the VA, etc. Uh, since they've added those notifications, the courts will likely see that as the applicant waiving their claim to unauthorized sharing of their personal data by signing the updated form. And it will also eliminate any claims of ignorance, meaning that you can't say, I didn't know they were going to do that or they wanted this, right? Because you signed the form now. So in Proverbs 11:3, it says, the integrity of the upright guides them, but the crookedness of treacherous destroys them. In this context, that means that applicants will now need to show greater integrity and be more forthcoming about their conditions, or their actions will destroy them. They will ruin their career, right? You will suffer the consequences of that. Now, the medical professionals involved, there were two doctors in the original Operation Safe Pilot who falsified their own FAA medical certificate applications so they could fly. They were ultimately charged and lost their license, right? And it just goes to show you that anyone can be charged and lose your license. You have to do the right thing. And that goes to show, right? I mean, we expect for medical professionals to be of the highest integrity, not just aviation medical examiners, right? And as I said, our whole system depends on the honesty of our applicants and your examination, meaning the AMEs. They have to do their examinations correctly and with integrity, because if they don't, that's how it leads to things like Operation Safe Pilot and people losing their license when they probably shouldn't have had one to begin with. And that's Dr. Tilton's words perfectly mimic Proverbs 11:3 about treachery and integrity. He also noted that most of the AMEs are doing the examinations correctly. However, that doesn't alleviate airmen, AMEs, or the FAA from their responsibilities of ensuring that the people who are getting these applications approved actually meet the standards. And since that's their job, we can expect that the FAA is not going to give up on this effort. They're going to keep looking into things like Operation Safe Pilot. So, expansion. The expansion was dubbed Operation Safe Pilot all over again. So the FAA began requiring pilots to disclose their disability benefits so it could start to increase oversight into people who maybe shouldn't have their certificates approved, but they were anyway. They started this in 2008. In 2022, the FAA's Office of Aerospace Medicine designated $3.6 million to hire medical experts and staff to re examine records of airmen that was provided to them by the Department of Veteran Affairs. These individuals were collecting disability benefits from the VA, but were also FAA medical certificate holders.
Officials are investigating nearly 5,000 pilots suspected of falsifying. Officials are investigating nearly 5,000 pilots suspected of falsifying their medical records to hide conditions that could prevent them from flying. According to the Washington Post, the pilots in question are military veterans who failed to report that they were also collecting benefits for disabilities. Of the pilots under investigation, about 600 are licensed to fly passenger airlines. The FAA has now closed about half of those cases. The agency has ordered about 60 pilots to stop flying while the records are reviewed.
Now, you can see from that clip, that's just what I was talking about, right? That story broke in 2023, where it was reported, right, that they were looking at a further 5,000 pilots, and with 600 of them being airline pilots, you could see why it was so critical. So, as you can imagine, the veterans who are involved with this, they're having their private information shared without their consent, are not happy, just like the people in the original Operation Safe Pilot.
Officials are investigating nearly 5.
So, starting in 2018, the Department of Justice reported that 4 veterans had been indicted for receiving VA benefits and not disclosing them to the FAA. And they found this during a cross-check of the VA's disability benefit system and the FAA medical certificate holders list who were receiving VA benefits in the state of California. And it should be noted that unlike the first one, this investigation was initiated by the VA and not the FAA. And as of now, there are no known lawsuits coming from veterans to the VA like there were with individuals in the original Operation Safe Pilot. So, Proverbs 12:19 says that truthful lips endure forever, but a lying tongue is but for a moment. So this means that honesty lasts forever, right? And a lie, even though it may get you something in the moment, it's gonna cost you in the long run. And that is the same as this case, right? With these airmen, they're lying on their FAA medical certificate applications. It may have gotten them across the line in their certificate in the short term, but in the long term, jail time, you lose your license anyway. So it's just not worth it, right? You have to tell the truth. So that's what, like, current airman certificate holders and applicants should be completely honest on their application and notify the FAA immediately upon discovering a mistake with any of your information. So one of the contributing factors for Stanmore Cooper from the FAA versus Cooper case, losing his license and his certificate, was that he continued to lie on his applications even after his condition of having being HIV positive was no longer a disqualifying condition. So perhaps if he had went back and told them the truth, maybe they would have been more lenient on him and understood his situation. Now, if it's an honest mistake and you report it to the FAA, like I said, they will be more willing to work with you, to work with airmen, and forgive the error. And the FAA is working with veterans who are receiving disability to update their records and reconcile their mistakes in their records so that they don't lose their license and they don't lose their certificates, right? And that's just an example of being honest, telling the truth, and letting them know that you made a mistake. And they're more likely would be more understanding and hopefully forgiving and work with these airmen who lied or at least weren't totally forthcoming. So you have two options for veterans. You can contact the FAA and notify them of the erroneous information, what's the mistake you made, or something you admitted, or you can apply for a new FAA Airman Medical Certificate and provide that information, missing information, then. Now, these are two very long videos. The first one here on the houseoversight.org is them talking Operation Safe Pilot. It's a committee hearing. It's about an hour and a half long. They go into some pretty in-depth information. It's a really good video. And the video that you cannot see, the thumbnail isn't working. You can click on it, open it up in YouTube and watch it. This is from Jim Wood speaking at California Law Center. And Jim Wood was Stanmore Cooper's lawyer in the FAA versus Cooper case. So, in conclusion here, so Operation Safe Pilot was a somewhat controversial investigation, but there's no doubt that it was a turning point for the future of aviation in the U.S. Congress requires FAA to promote safety and develop items that would make aviation safer. And this operation was part of those efforts. And while people in the U.S. may not like the Supreme Court's ruling on the FAA versus Cooper case, it's understandable because it's made it nearly impossible to prove Privacy Act violations by these government entities who are conducting these investigations. And these investigations have shown that certificate holders and applicants should be of the highest integrity and be as transparent as possible with the AMEs and the FAA. Because a lot of times these conditions, you can work through them, get a waiver, etc. Right? So just be honest. It's not worth it. It's going to cost you time and money and other things that it's just not worth it. Just tell the truth. And so if we do this, tell the truth, right? Following God's teachings, then you won't stray from the truth. You won't be you won't think about lying. Right? And we can be certain that these types of investigations will continue into the future. And, it will be interesting to see where the FAA heads next with this investigation. They haven't said where they're going, but it will be interesting to see. And that was all. These are the references. So thank you all for listening and have a good day.